Hello, I'm Morgan Jorgensen, the Donor Relations and Events Manager for the Truman Library Institute. I'd like to welcome you all this evening and thank you for your membership to the Truman Library Institute and support of the Truman Presidential Library. I'd like to take a minute to talk about some of the Institute's upcoming events. We're delighted to announce the speakers for this year's Bennett Forum on the Presidency. The fully virtual event will feature Heather Cox Richardson and Bill Moyers in conversation. And like this program, it will be an exclusive member event. Starting in December, the Truman Library Institute will begin our commemoration of Truman's decision to desegregate the military with our To Secure These Rights series. Over the course of several programs, our panel of special guests will discuss and analyze the events leading up to Truman's momentous decision. Dates for these programs are coming soon. Sign up for our email updates to make sure you don't miss the announcement. In addition to these great programs, the True Member magazine is coming your way. This can't miss edition is arriving in mailboxes this fall, with news about many exciting initiatives on the horizon for the Truman Library Institute. With a final and sincere thank you to all of you for your membership, I'll move on to the business of the evening. Tonight, we're joined by Clifton Truman Daniel, Harry Truman and Bess Truman's eldest grandson and honorary chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Truman Library Institute. Clifton is the author of several books, including Dear Harry, Love Bess, Bess Truman's Letters to Harry Truman, 1919 to 1943. Tonight, Clifton will be sharing stories from these letters, giving us a peek at the relationship between our favorite first couple. At the conclusion of the presentations, there will be a 10 to 15-minute Q&A session. Questions can be submitted during and immediately following the remarks via the Q&A feature in the Zoom control panel. You can also like a question that you would want to see answered. Without further ado, I will turn the program over to Clifton Truman Daniel.
Thanks, Morgan. Good evening, everybody out there. I'm glad that you can join us this evening. I know this is not the ideal way to talk to our members, but hopefully we're going to be through this pandemic soon. But in the meantime, I'm glad that you are all joining us this evening for this, and I'm glad to be able to be here to do it. I'll start off by saying that my grandparents, Grandpa was gregarious. He loved people. He was an open book. People sometimes ask me, did your grandfather ever tell you anything about any of his decisions that the rest of us don't know? And he didn't. He was remarkably consistent and candid all the way across the board. He wrote and said publicly everything that he needed to say about his decisions. He didn't tell family members anything different. But he was an open book, and he saved everything. When I was a kid in that house, there were rooms full of knickknacks, gifts, papers, paperweights, lighters. I especially liked the lighters, which my mother would never let me have. But they saved everything that they were given or they collected. And Grandpa did this with an eye toward history, as you can imagine. He thought that it was important that people understand the mind of their presidents. So he saved everything that he thought was important, and a lot of stuff that didn't seem important at the time. They saved speeches, they saved books, they saved notes. He saved everything he'd ever written down when he was thinking out loud on paper, which he did often when he had to make a tough decision or came to a turning point in his life. But he also saved gas receipts. He saved sales bills. He saved the tally, the kitchen tally, grocery lists. So we had this enormous treasure trove of things he saved. My grandmother was also something of a pack rat, but she did not view it the same way Grandpa did. During their courtship and marriage, they wrote hundreds of letters to each other back and forth, sometimes twice a day because you had morning and evening mail in those days. They wrote back constantly whenever they were forced to be apart. The Truman Library today owns 1,361 or 62 of my grandfather's letters to my grandmother, but we only own 184 of my grandmother's letters back. After they left the White House, it was around Christmas time 1955. Grandpa came home one afternoon and found my grandmother in front of a roaring fire, burning bundles of all the letters that she'd ever written him. And he stopped her and told her that, what are you doing? And she said, I'm burning the letters. And he said, well, you shouldn't do that. And she said, why not? And he said, well, for goodness sake, think of history. And she smiled and said, oh, I have, and kept chucking the bales in. She was a private person. She did not want her correspondence out there. As First Lady, when she came into office, she canceled Eleanor Roosevelt's regular press conferences and issued a succinct, short biography and requested that all questions thenceforth come to her in writing. And she almost always answered those questions with no comment. So she had a wide circle of friends. She loved friends and family, but as a public figure, she tended to keep her private life to herself. And there was one very good reason for that. And I think you all probably know this story, that when she was 18 years old, her father, David Willock Wallace, committed suicide. And it was devastating to my grandmother, devastating to her mother and her brothers. And it was something that the family just did not talk about. They did not bring up. Suicide, of course, in those days was much more of a stigma than it is today. But it was something that they kept a lid on throughout their lives. My mother didn't find out that her grandfather had committed suicide until she was in her 20s, I think. And that was an accident. An aunt just let it slip one day. Aunt Natalie let it slip to my mother, and my mother went to my grandfather and said, I had no idea that Grandpa David Wallace killed himself. And Grandpa told her sternly that she was never to talk about that again, and certainly never to talk about it to my grandmother. And then he went next door to Natalie and gave her down the country for letting that slip. So she kept her private life very private. But those 184 letters are fun. They cover the period, they cover the 1930s, the 1920s and 30s and early 40s. So it's about a 20-year period that was sort of Grandpa's political internship, if you will, during the years that he was a county judge in Jackson County and his years as a United States Senator. And of course, the last letter, as Morgan referred to with the title of this, the last letters are in 1943, right before, a year before he was nominated to the ticket with Roosevelt and became Vice President of the United States. So this covers that 20-year period. In the 20s, most of those letters are written from National Guard camp. They had to be apart for a couple of weeks every summer when Grandpa went to train with the Missouri National Guard, and they wrote back and forth. And the 1930s and 40s letters are when he was on the road as a senator. Some of the later ones when he was investigating waste, fraud, and mismanagement in the military, and the buildup before World War II and during the early years of the war. I matched those letters in a book in 2011 with my grandfather's letters, so at least you have them talking back and forth. But for me, it was a lot of fun because I knew my grandparents as Gammy and Grandpa. I did not know them as the 40-year-old Harry and Bess Truman. So it was fun for me to have them talking back and forth to each other. And there's some nice stories from those early years. Morgan, if we can put up that first slide. There we go. That's the only letter of my grandmother's that exists from 1919, from the World War I period, the end of the war. And this was written, as you can see, on March 16th, in a reply to a letter that he had written in February, because it took forever for letters to get back and forth from France to the United States. And a couple of things that interested me about this letter is that they're getting ready. They're going to get married when he gets home. She wanted to marry him before he left, but he refused, saying that he didn't want her to be a widow if he got killed, or spend the rest of her life taking care of someone who had been badly maimed or crippled in the war. So he said, when I come back in one piece, we'll get married. That picture of her that you're looking at right now, that was the picture of her that he took with him to France, to World War I, and the picture that he kept on his desk afterwards. The other thing that interests me about these letters is that they're not only planning to, what they're going to do when they get married, but also beginning to think of comparing. There's one section. My grandmother was she was a demon picnicker when they were courting in the teens. My grandmother used picnics, day-long picnics. They would walk miles and miles and miles into the country, carrying their food with them, find a nice spot to picnic, and then walk miles and miles back. And she used this in part as a way to weed out the complainers, especially among her suitors. And a couple of early suitors, fell by the wayside because apparently they just complained and moaned and griped the whole way, or didn't do their jobs, or didn't have a good time. Grandpa, of course, marched all the way, every picnic, he was all the way there and all the way back with her. So he passed that test. And in that letter, she alludes to the fact that Grandpa was having trouble and disagreements with a senior officer who I think was regular Army, or if not, he was a higher ranking National Guard officer. But Grandpa had been having a lot of trouble with him. And my grandmother compared war to picnics. She said, nothing will show up a slacker or somebody who's not up to snuff like war or picnics. So that's all in that letter back and forth from the front. Next one, Morgan, please. First thing that I always noticed about this was the first letter I ever read. When these letters came to me after my mother passed away in 2008, these letters came to me, and this was the first one I read just by chance. It was one of the early ones. And they were experimenting with nicknames together. You see that she's calling him Dear Petty. And at one other time she referred to him, she tried out Dear Old Sweetness. They finally settled on Harry and Bess, which I think was probably a good idea. But this was the first letter, and I laughed out loud because you can see what she wrote. It's now 10:20 and I am in bed. There was a big black bug on my bed when I turned the sheet down, and I had to kill it myself. But that wasn't the first time I had wished for you, which was the nice part of that letter. So she's on her own. And frankly, I always thought that my grandmother was more than capable of killing bugs on her own. She didn't fool around with her. I don't think she called for any help when that kind of thing arose. But this was the first letter that I read, and then that's just when I began to think about how do I put these together in the book? I need Grandpa's letters to see what his reaction to this was, or what sparked that. Next one, please, Morgan. And this, by the way, that letter, these letters were written back and forth. This is in 1923. Grandpa was camping, was in training with the Missouri National Guard at Fort Leavenworth. And just as an aside, the command, I'm going to get the title wrong. I think it's the command college. It's the War College at Fort Leavenworth, where they train senior officers. And I was invited a few years ago, and Clyde Wendell, our chairman, and I think Kurt Graham, our director, went with me. We were all there together for this. They inducted Grandpa into the Fort Leavenworth Hall of Fame. And of course, they have 5 offices at the college that they keep honoring the five-star generals that this country has had. One of them, of course, being Douglas MacArthur, with whom Grandpa did not get along, as you all know. And just before the ceremony, they were interviewing me in one of the offices, and the reporter was all lined up. He'd started the camera, and he was about to ask the first question, and one of the Army officers leaned over to me and said quietly, "You're in MacArthur's office." So never let it be said that the United States Army doesn't have a sense of humor. But he was at Fort Leavenworth. These letters back and forth, you'll see the quote that she says, "He'll now pull them the last of the week. Someday when it rains, I reckon, and he can't play golf. 3 have to come out." She had 3 infected teeth, badly infected teeth, and she had been trying for some time to get her dentist to remove these, and he kept putting it off. At one point, he said he had to consult with her, I think it was her GP. So he wanted to consult with her doctor or consult with another dentist, and he just wasn't doing it. And she finally got frustrated and said, I know what he's doing. He's going to wait till it's raining and he can't play golf, so then he'll do it. It wound up taking him more than an hour. And my grandmother said somewhere else in these letters, in this series of letters, she said that he gave her so much And I think she called it benzene. She gave her so much, gave her so many hypodermics. She said, he gave me so many hypodermics that my head feels funny. And she said that after the hour and 15 minutes or whatever it took him to remove the worst tooth, she said that he was probably more worn out than she was. Grandpa didn't think that that was funny at all. He wrote a letter back to her answering a lot of her other questions. He said, I feel like busting a dentist I know of. So he wasn't very happy with the doctor at all. But that's the kind of thing that they were writing. All these letters, what was really nice about them, it's all everyday stuff. It's the stuff that we all deal with. Hopefully not bad teeth that have to be pulled out all the time. But this is they talked about bills, they talked about my mother, they talked about friends, company, back and forth. Next one, please, Morgan. That's at National Guard camp, and this picture cracks me up. I don't know what he was thinking of with that mustache and those glasses. But this was one of the few times that my grandfather actually tried to grow facial hair, and he wrote that to my grandmother. He said, and an apt description in one of these letters, he said that it looks like he's wearing a hairbrush on his upper lip or a comb on his upper lip. But you all know that he was mostly clean shaven. Occasionally in Key West, I think he let it go for a few days. And there's one picture I think I've seen years ago that he's got stubble all over. It looks very fashionable, for the 1940s or 50s. He looks like your basic GQ model would today with the 3-day stubble. But he didn't. This was all experimenting with him, and he would joke about it to my grandmother. But either right before he went home or when he got home, he shaved it off all the time. And the guy who was right apparently finds it very amusing. I don't know who that is. In 1925, now he's at Fort Riley, Kansas. He only had the 1 year at Leavenworth, and now they're at Fort Riley, Kansas. My grandmother and my mother both did not like. They didn't like the water. They didn't like swimming. My mother, I found out when I was very young, I found out that Mom did not swim. I don't know that she ever learned, but all of our vacations when I was a kid, whether we were in Key West or whether we were at a rented house in the country outside New York, Mom was at the edge of the pool, but well back from the edge of the pool. Sometimes she'd sit on the side and dangle her feet in the water. But my grandmother, my mother, didn't like flying, didn't like pools. And Grandpa was delighted by this because he liked to swim. He always swam side stroke so he could keep his head and his glasses out of the water so he could see where he was going, because he was blind without those glasses. He had very bad eyesight, as all of you know. But he always swam side stroke, but he loved it. So he was delighted to have this pool. He said, I got the swimming suit by air. She sent him his swimming suit. And I'm very glad you sent it. We have swimming parties every afternoon while the pool is cold as the mischief. It's very good for us. And she wrote back at one point, she wrote back 2 different messages. She wrote back at one point, stay out of the deep end of that pool. And the other one was, no deep water swimming, please. It was a postscript to one of her letters. So she didn't want him, she'd rather he wasn't in the pool at all, but there wasn't much she could do about it. And in that vein, and that, by the way, I'll just address this. By the way, that's Grandpa on the left, and in the middle is John Snyder, who became a Kansas City banker, who became his Secretary of the Treasury. And on the right is Harry Vaughn, who became his military aide. So you've got Harry Vaughn and John Snyder and Grandpa in that picture, all looking very dapper in their boots and hats. My grandmother viewed these encampments as a rest for my grandfather. Rest and rejuvenation. He was working at the time, and this is during the 1920s, he was working within a corrupt political organization. And it was stressful. And he often suffered from headaches and heart palpitations. And Grandpa would work himself into a frazzle anyway, on top of worrying about who was trying to put one over on him, or who was trying to get what they didn't deserve, or who needed what, trying to answer legitimate concerns. All of that caused him enough stress generally, but then he compounded it by working constantly. Somebody once asked my grandfather, what do you do to relax? And Grandpa smiled and said, work. He liked to work, but he had a tendency to overwork. He had a tendency to work himself into a frazzle. And my grandmother knew this. So when she sent him to National Guard camp every summer, for her, that was great because this was a rest for him. It was riding horses, shooting guns, getting exercise. He had to get up and do calisthenics every morning, and they fed them really, really well. And a lot of the letters and I had to edit those 184 and an equal number of his back. A lot of the time in the 20s, he talked about what they were eating, and he would report to her what kind of food they were getting so she would know that he was getting a good meal. And he would say that his belt was getting too tight and he'd have to go out and do some extra bendovers, as he called the calisthenics, in the morning to make sure that his pants fit eventually. So this was, for her, this was therapeutic, and she fully supported his going to the National Guard camp every summer, although he sometimes thought it was a little nutty that he went back into it, having been through a war. He thought it was a little crazy. Yeah, he says in 1923, he says, I got up at 5:30, went down the end of the street in my pajamas, took a cold shower, ran back, dressed, and was ready for breakfast at 6:30. We had half a grapefruit, cream of wheat, ham, 2 eggs, 2 hotcakes, and coffee, and I ate it all. She probably enjoyed that. After breakfast, I went for a physical examination, shut my mouth, said ah, bent over, hopped on one foot, then the other, had my heart tested, my lungs tapped, and my throat examined. And the old major who did it said that I sure am a healthy specimen. Aren't you glad to hear that? And she probably was, although sometimes she sounds like she didn't believe him, or she thought he was overdoing it. The letter that she returned, she said that was some breakfast. You'll have to be pretty strenuous to keep that front down. So she enjoyed that he was there, that he was getting some rest. But a lot of those letters from the 20s had that kind of report in them because he knew she worried about him. Next one, please, Morgan. Oh, here we go. 1925. The ladies of the day this was the age of the short haircut. My grandfather, to the end of his life, and even a little before that, when he was writing his memoirs, he actually wrote in his memoirs describing seeing my grandmother for the first time when she was 5 years old and he was 6. He fell in love right then and there at the age of 6 because she had the deepest, clearest blue eyes and what he described as the golden curls of yesteryear. He loved her long, blonde, curly hair. And she had apparently, right before he went off to National Guard camp, she had said, I would really like to get my hair cut short like the other ladies of my age. And he had apparently balked at that. You know, he liked her hair the way it was. And so they didn't reach any kind of an agreement. So he went off to National Guard camp and they continued the argument through the mail. And here she is. This was a great comment. Here she is. She's talking about his cousins, Ethel and Nellie Noland, who lived across the street from 219 North Delaware, from my grandmother's house, from their house. They were both teachers and they had both had their haircuts, and she's using them as the argument. Ethel had her haircut today and she looks great. Please, may I do it? I never wanted to do anything as badly in my life, and I love, come on, be a sport. And he relented. He finally relented in telling her, you know, if you want to do it, go ahead. You know, don't worry about what I think about it. I'm sure you'll be just as beautiful with it off, and I will not say anything to make you sorry for doing it. That message apparently either didn't sink in all the way, or that she wanted a much more enthusiastic response, because what he said in part of this quote from the letter, this excerpt, he said, you know, you always do what you want about these kind of things anyway, and I support that, so go ahead and do it. But I think she wanted more than that, because in a couple more letters after he says this, she's still asking, you know, what about the haircut? Can I go and have my haircut? So I think she wanted something just a little more thrilled out of him, and he wasn't going to do it. But she did eventually, she did get it cut, and there it is. There she is with the short hair, and that's my mother with her back to the camera. Now, I think she was probably about 3 or 4 years old when that picture was taken. So she finally got the haircut that she wanted, but they had to argue it out through the mail. And I just like this. This is an earlier letter, but it says they hated to be apart from each other. I mean, they understood the necessity of it. And as I said, the National Guard encampment was, for him, for both of them, it was a tonic. She was so glad that he was getting his head clear and the headaches cleared up and the heart palpitations stopped and he was getting fit and he was with friends and he was doing something he loved. So she really enjoyed that, and he enjoyed doing it as well, but they hated to be apart. And especially later on when circumstances, when politics or business forced them apart, when he had to go on the road in inspecting plants before and during the war. So they wrote as much as they could and reported everything. I mean, a lot of these letters are long letters. Some of them are a page, but they're more often 2 or 3 pages long, reporting everything that's happening, comings and goings of friends. My grandmother reported what she bought. She also reported the fun stuff. In one early letter, she said that she had gotten up at the crack of dawn, before dawn, to watch her neighbors, the Smiths, leave for their vacation, just apparently so that she could catch Mrs. Smith in her underwear. She said, I wouldn't have missed seeing Mrs. Smith in her knickers for $100. And I have no idea why she thought that was funny. But they reported everything, they talked about everything, they stayed in touch. And sometimes they called each other, sometimes even sent telegrams. But this sort of sums it up for me when she writes lots and lots of love, and please keep on loving me as hard as ever. You know, I feel as if a large part of me has been gone for the last 10 days. Devotedly, Bess. And there isn't anybody else on earth I'd stop to write this time of day. So they, you know, it was a long and close relationship. Seriously, starting when he was 6 years old and she was 5. Although for the first 20 years, she didn't pay much attention to him. He carried a torch for her from that age on, but they were just classmates. One of the few times that my mother said that my grandmother mentioned Harry Truman to a friend is that when he had to start working for Jim Clinton's drugstore down the square in Independence. She said it's too bad. She just told a friend they went by him one day when he was sweeping the sidewalk, and she said it was too bad that he had to work before and after school. He bookended his school day at Clinton's. He didn't work there that long. I think it was just a few months, and then his father told him to quit and concentrate on his schoolwork. But they stayed in touch. They wrote always with a sense of humor, always with their opinions on people. There was one letter that we don't have for the screen that I love. Just shows kind of a difference in their character. Grandpa went to National Guard camp one summer. I think it was in 1927. Excuse me, I'll duck down and find my copy of my own book here, which I barely know how to read half the time. He had borrowed a car from a friend, and he writes that they got a flat, but here, I'll read it to you. Dear Bess and Margie, and that's what they called my mother. Even it was Margaret, it was never Margie, it was always Margie with a hard G, or Marg or Marger. Dear Bess and Margie, and this is July 10th, 1927, when my mother was 3 years old. We arrived on schedule, that is in time to take a bath and have our noonday meal here at Fort Riley. We'd have been about 40 minutes earlier, but for a nail in the right front tire at Manhattan, Kansas. It happened right in town and only 1 block from a garage, or we'd have been in a nice fix because there was no jack in the car. I shall probably unburden my sentiments to friend Oliver, from whom he borrowed the car, when I return. If he had my job and I his, I'd expect a good going over under the same circumstances, and I'd probably get it. Now, he's talking tough there about friend Oliver, but my grandmother knew him better than that. She wrote back, oh no, that's not him, that's when yes, she says on July 12th, 2 days later, she says, yes, I think Mr. Oliver ought to hear about it, but you'll calm down before you get home and he will never know anything about it. Maybe it would be a good idea to say nothing and let the same thing happen to him and hope for the worst. That's the Christian spirit, huh? So she could be a little harder on people, and she knew that Grandpa, and he probably did. He probably never said anything to Mr. Oliver about the jack, but about being mean about it, but I doubt that he let it drop. He would have told Mr. Oliver that Jack wasn't in the car, so the same thing wouldn't happen to him. But that was the difference between him. My grandmother could be a little bit less forgiving on two people than my grandfather could. But again, a close relationship, writing. I keep thinking that if those two, God, if they had texts, if they'd had email, I mean, I think they either would have loved this or they never would have gotten anything done because they've been writing to each other the whole time. But it certainly would have taken them less time to do it. My train of thought is derailing here. Morgan, do we want to try a question or two to start off with?
Absolutely.
Brain
We
going
will
again.
move into the question and answer portion of the evening. So if you have a question for Clifton and have not asked it yet, please go ahead and do so now. You can do that in the Q&A part of your Zoom toolbar. And we have one question here. It's a little bit off topic, but Clifton, I'm sure you're perfectly ready to answer it. It's from Frank. And Frank asks, can you tell us about the 3 steps required when you came in the back door of the house in Independence? And did you ever skip a step?
Frank, it sounds like you know this story. Yeah, family always came in. We hardly ever used the front door. I've used the front door more as a tourist than I ever did when my grandparents were alive. We always drove around the side of the house, the driveway along the side of the house, and pulled in the back and got out on the asphalt in front of the garage and back, and came in through the kitchen. And the first thing that my brother and I always did when we came in the house was check the pantry to see if Vieta Gar had baked us a tin of brownies. Vieta made the best brownies in the world. They were perfect. They were usually, by the time we got there, they were still warm and they were gooey in the center, crunchy on the outside, perfect. And so I always went back into the pantry and checked to see if the brownie tin, and I didn't even have to open the tin. If there was wax paper sticking out from under the lid, I know that she had put the brownies in there and separated the layers with wax paper. So that was step 1. Step 2 was to go by Grandpa's study, which was you walked out of the kitchen across one end of the dining room, and the study door was right there, and you had to stick your head in the door and say hi to Grandpa. And then step 3 was to go upstairs, drop your bags, and check to see that all the toys that my grandmother had bought us previously were all still in their right places in the drawers in our bedrooms. What Frank is referring to is that we skipped step 2 one day. Excuse me. We skipped it when I was 14 years old and Will was 12. It was the year before Grandpa passed away. And at that point, both of us had hair down to our shoulders. Grandpa hated long hair on men. He really did not like that trend. The entire 60s drove him nuts. There was the story of the young man with long hair who stopped him on the street in Independence during one of his walks, and just politely to say, "Good morning, Mr. President." And Grandpa shook his hand and said, "Good morning, young man. You'd look a lot better if you went to see a barber." So he didn't like the hair, and he came out of his study, and my mother was coming through the dining room, and he stopped her and he said, "Who are the 2 long hairs walking through my house?" And my mother swallowed hard and said, "Those are your 2 oldest grandsons." And he said, "Well, they didn't say hello. Get them back here." So she came upstairs, dragged us back down and said, "You say hello to your grandfather." And we stood in front of him and I said, "Hi, Grandpa." And he said, "What?" And I said, "I just came to say hello." And he said, "Well, do it then." And I said, "Hello." And Will said, "Hello." And he turned on his heel and went back in the study. He was not happy to see that hair. Just as an aside to that, I thought my grandmother was different. 2 years after Grandpa died, she came to visit us over Christmas when we were living in Washington, D.C. And by that time, my hair was where I could tuck it in my front shirt pocket. And I came down to breakfast, and my grandmother was sitting in the breakfast nook in the kitchen. My mother was making breakfast for one of my brothers across the room. And I sat down, got a bowl of cereal, sat down, started eating. My grandmother looked at me, and in a very loud, clear voice, she said, "My goodness, you have beautiful hair." And my mother dropped the spatula and said, "Mother, for God's sake, don't tell him that. He'll never get it cut." True. Every time my mother said I should just get a trim or anything, I said, "No, Bess Truman likes my hair." Well, years later, the Truman Library gave me a letter that my grandmother had written to her friend, Mary Bastian. And in the middle of the letter, she starts talking about a friend who had trouble with some hippies. She said, "I'm so sorry she's had trouble with those hippies. It seems something ought to be done about them. When I saw my two oldest grandsons with long hair, I nearly expired. Thank goodness they were clean and had on good clothing." So the hair bothered her every bit as much as it bothered my grandfather. But my grandmother was willing to overlook that just to annoy my mother.
That's excellent, Clifton. I really now I'm going to have to go find a picture of you with this long hair. I can't wait. We have another question from Dan. Dan asks, can you describe their communications when Harry was in the White House? My understanding is Bess chose to remain home in Independence for long periods of time.
Thanks, Dan, for joining us and for the question. She did go home for long periods of time, but she didn't do it. She did it for a reason. There was always a tug of war between my grandfather and his mother-in-law, Madge Gates Wallace. I said earlier that David Wallace had committed suicide. That sort of drove Madge to be more or less a recluse. She didn't go out a lot. She didn't do much socially. And she relied on my grandmother to not only take care and manage the household, but because my grandmother was her oldest child and only daughter, they had a shared, my mother always thought that they had shared pain over David's suicide. So Madge relied on my grandmother heavily, and was the minute my grandmother went off to Washington, Madge started wheedling for her to come home. And Grandpa was doing it on the other side. When my grandmother was home, Grandpa wanted her back in Washington. So she was constantly she had to manage both sides of her life. So she spent time in Independence because she felt she was needed and she couldn't leave her mother alone. So it wasn't that she wanted to be away from Grandpa, but and of course they wrote back and forth for that, and they called and sent telegrams. So, people think that she didn't like Washington or didn't want to be there. She did. She enjoyed her time in Washington, particularly as a senator's wife. But it was this constant tug of war from her mother wanting her to come home and help manage the house. David McCullough wrote a great story in his 1993 Pulitzer Prize winner, Truman. They had been apart for, I think, a couple of months. And this is when, during his second administration, when they were living over at Blair House, across the street from the White House. And they hadn't seen each other. And when my grandmother got to Blair House, the place just lit up. My grandparents were so happy to be in each other's company again. And this always gives the lie to the idea that she hated Washington or didn't like my grandfather enough. They were just delighted to be in each other's company, and it lit up the whole household. Everybody on the staff everybody was in a good mood. It was a great day. And the next morning, my grandmother came downstairs and found the head usher and said, we have a problem upstairs on the in our room. There's hell feels one of the slats on the bed is broken. So very happy couple, probably more than a grandson wants to know.
Right along those lines, we've got a question from Dan, a different Dan, that says, how much affection did Harry and Bess show one another around their family members, especially Bess's mother?
Oh, especially Bess's mother. I don't know. That's a good question, Dan. They were affectionate. I can't imagine that they probably gave a nod to decorum when they were around Madge. Grandpa never had a cross word to say about his mother-in-law, although he was clearly not her top choice for a son-in-law. Madge would have been happier with, well, frankly, she wouldn't have been happy with anybody, because she relied on my grandmother so closely, so much that anybody coming along and dividing my grandmother's attention would have been sort of unwelcome. But I think she would have been happier with a multimillionaire than with farmer, soldier, haberdasher, county judge, senator, and vice president and president. There's the story that I tell, but it's probably apocryphal, that my grandmother, that my great grandmother never thought that my grandmother had married very well, and continued to tell her so even in the White House. You know, Bess, I think you could have done better standing in the East Room. So, but it was, I'm sure that they had some decorum around Madge, but I can't imagine that they would have just turned it off completely. And they were, again, being public figures, you couldn't be too demonstrative. But that's why I like that story that David McCullough found, you know, that they were still very much in love with each other and very affectionate well into their 60s.
We have time for a few more questions here. Clifton, can you tell us a little bit more about how these letters from Bess were found and where they were found?
Well, thanks, Morgan. I completely forgot that step, didn't I? Those letters were found by Ray Gesselbrocht, who was the former special assistant to the director of the Truman Library, and the late Liz Safley. And not long before my grandmother died, and this would have been in the early 1980s, Gammy died in 1982. And this would have been not long before that, because she was 97 when she died, but because she was older and because there were so many people in and out of the house, and that includes Secret Service and a Navy corpsman, they had medical personnel around. There were a lot of people coming and going, and my mother thought it was time to do an inventory of everything that was in the house, sort of, you know, unhappily looking toward the end and what was going to happen next. I think she knew that my grandmother intended to leave the house to us, to the American public, to the American people. But she ordered this inventory of the house, and Ray and Liz and others from the Truman Library carried that out. And Liz told me that she found those letters, she and Ray found those letters, the 184, tucked into the backs of drawers or tucked into books as bookmarks. And I asked Ray, I said, how on earth did she miss those? And Ray said, well, I think it was just a matter of poor housekeeping. She just forgot they were there and didn't clean them up, didn't go after them in 1955. I was absolutely shocked that they actually made a fairly linear record, you know, from National Guard in the 20s to the Senate in the early 30s and to the Senate in the early 30s and early 40s, so that they sort of hold together, you know, their holes, their gaps. But I was surprised that if she missed them, she did a really good job for me, missing them the way she did.
Excellent. And we'll do one more question. This one's from Jewel. And can you tell us a little bit about your grandparents' relationship after Truman was no longer president, when they retired together back to independence?
They retired. He was the last president. They didn't have Secret Service protection until after John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. I think the Secret Service began, I want to say 64. So the early days when I knew him, he had Mike Westwood, I think former Independence or Kansas City police officer, drove Grandpa around, kind of watched over him, but it wasn't a full-time job. The Secret Service didn't arrive, like I said, for the first 10 years. So it was, he went back home. He walked around Independence by himself. They went back to their pre-Senate lives. They renewed old acquaintances. My grandmother went back to her bridge club and her other clubs or other social activities. Grandpa gave some speeches. They did some traveling. They of course, the best trip that they took was when they both got in the car. I think the first spring that they were out of the White House, spring of 1953, just threw the bags in the car and took off across the country to go back to Washington, stop and visit friends on the way. A guy named Matthew Algeo wrote a very good book about that called Harry Truman's Excellent Adventure. I don't know how excellent it was because they stopped traffic, they clogged hotels, they upset town police departments because, of course, they pull into a hotel or a motel. The owner or the switchboard operator would tell the rest of the town that former President Harry Truman was there, and everybody would show up. So they kind of, I think the police departments told them afterwards, please don't do that again, just fly, if you're going to go somewhere. But they went back to their normal lives. One of my favorite stories, and it made it into the play that I do these days, Give 'Em Hell, Harry. Right after that first spring, my grandmother looked out the window and she said to my grandfather, Harry, the grass is getting kind of long. It's time to get the mower out. And Grandpa hated cutting the grass. It was just not a job he liked. And he said, I don't like doing that job. And she said, listen, I know, but you're not president of the United States anymore. You're going to have to cut your own grass. So he said, all right. And he didn't do it. And she nagged him a bit more. And he said, yep. Top of my to-do list. And he didn't do it. And she nagged him a bit more. And finally, one morning, he rolled up his shirt sleeves and went out to the shed and got the mower and started cutting the grass. Well, it was Sunday morning. And everybody else in town was going to church and passing the house. And here in the yard is the former president of the United States, obviously not going to church, cutting the grass instead, and waving at everybody who went by so that they would be sure to see that he was doing this. And my grandmother ran out of the house. She saw him, she ran out of the house, she cut the mower off and she said, don't you ever do that again. Grandpa said, okay. They hired a yard guy after that to cut the grass. So he got out of the job. My mother said, I don't know why she was talking about her own mother, about my grandmother. She said, I don't know why she thought she could outwit the man who outwitted Stalin. And years later, when I first joined the board of the Truman Library, the library called me and asked me if I would write a letter of congratulations to a gentleman who had just retired as lay minister of his church. He was 93 years old. And he just retired as lay minister of the church. Would I write him a letter? And I said, I'd be happy to, but tell me for the letter, what was his connection to the family? And they laughed and they said, well, he used to cut your grandfather's grass. That was his day job. So Grandpa not only used a church to get out of mowing the lawn, but then he turned around and hired clergy to do it.
That's excellent. Well, we will call it there. And Clifton, I hope that this next part doesn't prevent you from saying yes when I call next time to ask you to do a program. But special thanks to my behind the scenes co-host, Cassie Pekarsky, for finding this excellent picture of you in your youth with your long hair.
Oh my God.
I think it suits you. I think you should bring it back.
Yeah, well, I don't know why they have a microphone in front of my face. I can't sing to save my life. So, but this is what my grandparents were afraid of. He's not playing the piano, but banging on a drum set, and he has hair down to his shoulders. Great.
Oh, goodness. Well, thank you, Clifton, for sharing your time and talents with us this evening and bringing these stories to life. Don't miss our upcoming Whistle Stops, exploring Truman's relationships with Tom Pendergast and Tom Veach, and Truman's time in the Senate. Like I said, my behind the scenes co-host Cassie was quick with that picture, and she hosts these Whistle Stops and does an excellent job. Registrations are open now on our website at trumanlibraryinstitute.org. For more of Bess Truman's correspondence, you can purchase Dear Harry, Love Bess wherever books are sold. Clifton, thank you again for joining us this evening, and thanks everyone for your support of the library. Good night.
Thank you, Morgan. Thank you everyone for joining us. And Cassie, you are in a lot of trouble.